of you. I really am looking forward to this collaboration. We have some very, very good interests in common for all of our people. I wish you all well, stay healthy. And with that, let's get started. Oma. I'm Frances Ragle. I am the daughter of a man who said he was Nisenan. I'm 69 years old, and I live on property that was part of the homestead. I think that I'm not real clear on the time when that happened, but my father married a woman whose mother was a catalog bride from England. And my dad, she swore up and down that she was going to marry an Indian, and she did. And I'm one of the results. I have a brother and a sister, and we've lived on this property since the beginning, as far as I know. It's a homestead, 140 acres. And as a group of Native Americans, we established a foundation called Todd's Valley Miwok Maidu Cultural Foundation. It was set up as a foundation to support our people in healthy ways and to help them educate our community public in our history and our ancestry. The BLM were kind enough to gift us as a use permit for public purpose and recreation, 18.5 acres of a 56-acre parcel in Forest Hill that we, from the beginning, were building a cultural center. We started with a roundhouse. We have a foundation. We have a beginning of a Miwok village and 18.5 acres that has been neglected. And it finally became very apparent to us that we were responsible for it when the pine trees started to die because of beetle kill. And at that point, we asked BLM, can we please do something about this? They kind of said, well, good luck. So I went to the local Fire Safe Council, and through connections, finally got a grant to clear the pine beetle trees off of our property. And with that, the idea was presented that, well, if we've gone that far, let's restore the whole acreage to ancestral management so that we could have access to the resources and the area for not only whatever we could get for our sustenance, but also for our spirit and our health. And that was when we started coming up with the concept that let's put this property back to its ancestral management, which includes, of course, burning. And BLM doesn't like burning on their property, but we've managed to work around that. And with Chris's help, I think we have a concept that is going to prevent forest fire, wildfire in our area, but also be able to give our people some pride in their efforts and in their history. So that's basically where we are. And Chris has been a great help to us and a very good mentor. And through connections with CalFire and NRCS and other agencies, even our local public utilities district, we have come this far, and it looks as though we have a good future.
Awesome. Thanks so much for the introduction, Frances. Chris, do you want to pick up where she left off?
Yeah, you got me, John? Well, audio is good still?
Yeah.
Okay. So My name is Chris Paulus. I'm a retired CalFire battalion chief, and I currently reside in Colfax, which are the ancestral lands of the Mission, or the South Maidu, or Southern Maidu. And quick introduction is I started, had an interest in wild edible plants as a young boy. And that was kind of what motivated me. I was born and raised in the Sierra Nevada mountain range, born in Grass Valley, California. Again, grew up on the San Juan Ridge and what is now known as the Inland Forest for the folks working in Epi's ground, Johnny and Amber and folks like that. And entered into CalFire CDF back in 1978, retired in 2016. And so what I have is about 45 years of wildland fire control, working with native plants and doing fuels management. I'm currently the project manager for the North Fork American River Shaded Fuel Break, which is the largest fuels treatment undertaken in Placer County since the days of the old CCC in the 1930s. And one of the techniques that I employed as a project manager is fire mimicry, where we've gone in mechanically and as we work with the native plant community, we look at if fire was allowed to cross this landscape, what would the native plants look like in response to fire? And I'll get a little more into that. So that's said and done. That's just kind of a brief overview of what I am and what I do.
Awesome. Thank you so much. We're going to go through and let everybody do the introduction. Just to reiterate, we'd like to hear your name, why you're here today, and whose land you're on. So let's start with Melissa Thomas.
Hey, am I on mute or not?
Now we can hear you.
Okay. So my name's Melissa Thomas. I live on the ridge, on the San Juan Ridge, in the what's called the old town of Cherokee. And I don't know I don't know enough to say exactly whose land I live on.
You're on Nisenan land.
Yeah, so I assume that, but I don't know if there was some more appropriate way or better, more clear, more another way to say that. And I've lived on this piece for 27 years and on the ridge for I think 38 and raised my kids here. And my piece is just 2 acres. And my daughter and her husband bought property, a piece that's 90 acres that is has what we call Smiley's Pond on it, which is like a 5-acre lake. It's just a few hundred feet from my house. And that needs a lot of attention. There's not even a house on it.
Right.
So there's a lot of attention. So we're planning to do quite a lot of burning there. And I have goats on my land, so I don't even have anything to burn anymore. But the 90 acres does. And as a matter of fact, we had wasn't even a control burn. It was just a little fire that was supposed to last about 30 minutes with some cattails, broken down cattails a few days ago, and it got out of the embers, flew into the dry forest, really, really dry. And we had to call, for the fire department, and had a lot of trucks come out there, and it was scary. It was terrifying for a bit, but it all ended very well. It looks beautiful. It looks like a control burn.
All right, thanks, Melissa. Just to reiterate, y'all, just want a really quick introduction, name, whose land you're on, and why you're here today. Amber.
Hey, my name's Amber Cohn. I'm on the board of the Yuba Watershed Institute, which works with the BLM land, so I'm really curious how this is going to fit together. And I live on Nisenan land that I've been stewarding for 9 years. Thanks.
Awesome. Thanks for joining us, Amber. Richard, would you like to go next?
Sure. Richard Berg. I'm in the Russian River watershed, land of the Pomo and Miwok. I've been participating in a call called Facing Fire for more than a year, which was started by some folks connected to Regenerating Paradise. So I've been tracking what we should be doing with fire for quite a while.
Awesome. Thank you for joining us, Richard. I'd like to talk with you more offline, so maybe send me an email. Let's see, Marcus.
Marcus Ruiz Evans, big fan of Return California. Wrote a book in 2012 saying all federal land should be returned to the indigenous. Here from day one with Return California, big supporter. Thanks for having me out.
Thanks, Marcus. Joy.
Hello, my name is Joy Holland. I'm coming to you from Gabrielino Tongva land, who are the traditional caretakers of Los Angeles and the South Channel Islands. I am the librarian for the American Indian Studies Center at UCLA, and I'm interested in this and the entire series actually because of the good and admirable goal of trying to repatriate land to Native people. So thank you for having me.
Yeah, I learned recently it's rematriate.
Oh, I like that better.
I thought you might. All right, Jason, right, quick intro, where you're calling from?
Yeah, Jason Wright, currently in Marin County on, if I have this right, Miwok and Ohlone land.
That's right.
Originally from Placer County, Nevada County area, huge supporter of indigenous rights and issues, and willing to help join the, the group trying to find some solutions to all the problems.
Thanks so much, Jason. TJ. You're muted. Ansu, would you like to introduce yourself quickly?
Sure. Hi, everyone. I'm sorry, I can't start my video for some reason, so I'll just radio in. My name is Ansu John. I am in the San Gabriel Valley, which is Tongva lands. I am particularly interested in issues of indigenous epistemology and challenging sort of these structures of thought that are dominated by sort of white colonialism and Western science. And so I look at traditional ecological knowledge through the lens of epistemology, just different ways of being and seeing the world. And I'm a writer and a gardener, and came to this, I think, through the film Gather. So I'm very interested in learning about other activities around the state of California. Thanks.
Thank you so much, Ansu. I thought your name was familiar. I remember seeing it during the screening of Gather. That was such an incredible film. If any of you on the call haven't seen it, highly recommended. It's all about food sovereignty and indigenous foodways. And yeah, it was really, really beautiful film. All right, so without further ado, I think Chris is going to start his PowerPoint. I'd appreciate if you guys would take notes or just ask questions in the chat, and then we'll have a Q&A afterward and call it a day. Until next first Tuesday. So without further ado, Mr. Paulus.
So, all right, Johnny, make sure I don't screw this up here. So let me make sure. Okay.
Do I think I might need to give you, I'm going to make you a host so you can share your screen.
Hopefully you and I can figure this out together, right? Try it here.
Yeah, at the bottom of the screen, there's a share screen button. And it did say started screen sharing.
So let me pull this up here. Let's start from the beginning. So can you all see that?
I don't see it. All I see is that it says you
No.
start. Oh, there it is.
And it may take a while to travel the satellites. Okay, so sometimes there's a little bit of a time delay here, so I'll try to go slow here. So John, I'm going to use the backstop to make sure that I have my slides. That way, yeah.
You're breaking up a lot, Chris. Maybe turn off your video. In the bottom left
Okay.
corner, you can click stop video. That'll save some bandwidth. Yeah, there you go. And then you're gonna want to have a slideshow.
Okay, you got it there, John. Does that work, John?
We're still having trouble with your audio. Let me actually, you sent this PowerPoint to me. Let me try doing screen sharing. I'm going to
Try it from your end.
yeah, I'm going to revoke that and try it from my stop. Hold on one second.
I'm going to stop share on my end here.
Yeah. All right, I'm gonna try mine. Can you all hear me okay? Chris, you're still breaking up.
Yeah, how's this, John? This better?
Oh yeah, much better. Great.
Yeah, you pull it up on you.
Yeah, hold on. All right, I'm reclaiming the host and I have that. All right, let me know when you guys can see it. And then Chris, you can just tell me when you want to go to the next slide and I'll do that.
All right, John, we'll co-host this thing. Yeah, you go ahead and full screen, John, if you can there.
How's that?
All right, we're there.
All right.
And it's taking a little while here. It's a bit choppy on my end, but I think we'll be fine. So with that said, listening to the different callers. So today what I want to discuss with you folks on this roundtable is traditional ecological knowledge in indigenous management practices. And I heard one caller in talk about traditional knowledge or ancient knowledge. And so one of the things I think is very key with a traditional ecological knowledge is understanding that there has to be societal acceptance of this, and society has to see the value of this. Most folks that are familiar with indigenous management practices are a very select few, very small group. And so when you look at our society, we're very narcissistic people. And the first question that we ask ourselves as a whole, maybe not true individually, is what's in it for me? So when we look at that, and that is what's in it for me, is that's where the beauty of TEK and IMP has impacts into the computer programmer at Silicon Valley, and it has impacts all the way to people, to basket weavers. And it's tying that all together that people realize this is what's occurring here. So the first slide up is a restored forest. This forest has been restored through mechanical treatment, removal of the heavy brushes initially, then the reintroduction of fire. So John, next slide, please. So what this was originally is I did a tribal cultural workshop. I was invited by the state tribal preservation officers and state preservation officers, and this was a PowerPoint I did on behalf of the ancestral Californians down in the United Auburn Indian Community was the host down in basically just outside Roseville, California. Next slide, please. So I start this off with this, that is, without plants, we are nothing. And what is lost on people, and to me this is very important, this is where I kind of geek out a little bit here. Without plants, there's literally no life on planet Earth. It cannot exist without, our life cannot exist without plants. And we learn about photosynthesis in school, but if you think about it, what a plant can do is take photon energy from nuclear fission from a star and take that photon energy and in turn convert it into matter and mass, aka a plant. And then from those plants, we derive our life. So one of the fundamental things in society that we have slipped from is the value and importance of our plant communities, and here locally in California, particularly our native plant community. Next slide, please. So this was as you see, a tribal cultural resource and cultural landscapes through fire ecology. So what we have used is native plant restoration using basically traditional ecological knowledge. And if you look at that picture there, the forefront, those purple flowers of clusters, those are blue dicks. Those were geophytes, bulbs harvested by indigenous people. And then the remaining wildflower background are just basically those things that enhance the soil. So this is really, you know, a restored ecosystem here where you have tremendous value in this alone the pollinating insects. But again, this was stored using traditional ecological knowledge. Next slide, please, John. So you look at California, California was uniquely honored by the first people, the First Nations folks here. And indigenous people, ancestral Californians, they managed the natural resources to a desired state. And the desired state was heavily chronicled by the missionaries and the pioneers. It wasn't until researchers began to listen to the Indians and they began to connect that oral history to these stories found in journals, and out began to emerge this knowledge of traditional ecological knowledge. So the subclimax state of a forest, that is ponderosa pines, black oaks in this part of California, that subclimax state was the most beneficial to the tribes. But this was the amazing part is there is this misunderstanding that indigenous people were the benefactors of some random act of nature. Rather, indigenous peoples were very interactive with the native plant community, and through thousands of years of plant interaction, they developed this incredible technology of stewardship that brought California to its highest zenith of biodiversity known to date. So what happened is they developed this brilliant and elegant environment they created through interaction with the plant community. And one of the principal tools in California that was utilized was fire. And as an example, 54% of all California ecosystems are truly fire dependent. In other words, they are dependent upon fire. And that lack of fire has in part is one of the reasons we are in a degraded state ecologically in California. Next slide, please. And by the way, that previous slide was bold tube irises. Those irises, the roots were harvested by natives here for the purpose of basketry. So this site's up in Mount Howe here in Colfax, California, and it was really a resiliency and biodiversity project that we conducted on behalf of CalFire when I was employed for CalFire to basically test out these theories. Next slide, please. So what it was shortly was we went out to Mount Howe, which is a state-owned land, and 38 acres up there, and we wanted to reintroduce fire using traditional ecological knowledge, and there's lots of benefits from that. So I go back to societal benefits. One of the reasons was to create a fire resilient forest and tie into a fuel treatment area to reduce high damaging, high intensity wildfires. And in that, we wanted to test out the theories of repeated use of fire. And we call the fire return interval. So in short, as you can read, that's what generated this project. So that gives you the general location. So next slide, please, John. So we talk about fire return interval. It's very important to understand is that simply put, how often a fire burns across the landscape. Natural FRIs caused by lightning were predominant for thousands upon thousands of years, but entered the ancestral Californians over thousands of years, combined with natural fire and anthropogenic fire. They began to put more and more fire on the landscape, which began to alter the plant community, and from that plant community, the net result is this traditional ecological knowledge, or a portion of it, TEK. And when I say a portion of TEK, bear in mind, indigenous people also literally, if they didn't like a certain plant, just like we do in a garden, they pulled it up by the roots. They cut, or copiced for plants. So they had a whole plant strategy they went after that. But my expertise is really more in the fire side of things, going back to drawing upon my fire suppression career. Next slide, please. So this is what's really important. We talk about fire dependency of 54% of California's ecosystems. What happened over about, say, a 10,000 year period of natural fire return intervals and anthropogenic or indigenous FRIs, the plant community developed fire adaptive traits. And for example, certain plants are fire tolerant, that is, they tolerate fire just fine. Some do not tolerate fire at all. Some are fire adaptive, they need fire. Or they've taken advantage of their plant's morphology, that is the way the plant is structured to take advantage of fire. Some are non-fire adaptive. Some plants avoid fire by where they locate in aspect and slopes and canyons. And some plants are totally fire dependent, some are fire following. So the indigenous FRIs and their applications were the principal management tool that enhanced these traits and plant associations. So as fire was applied to the ground by indigenous folks for whatever they wanted from that plant community, is what kind of shaped and formed large parts of these plant communities and how the plants would associate with one another. Next slide, please. And oh, John, that plant right there, that's wild ginger. And it's a very subtle plant, but again, it's kind of unique. Yeah, that's like that. So I apologize. I mean, why we have these quote unquote pretty plants up. Again, this is wild ginger. It's a native plant to this region. And for example, the Colfax area here, this part of Placer County, California, there's over 800, nearly 800 native plants associated with the Colfax area of this part of the Sierra Nevada mountain range. In California alone, there's only 8,000 native plants, and is one of the most rich native plant communities in the world. California exclusive, and the richest in North America. So next slide, please. But here's the key. This is part that I really want folks to focus in on. This native ecosystem here in the Sierra Nevada, it's human adaptive. And that is the indigenous people utilization of fire as a management tool. And they develop much resiliency and adaptive traits of this forested ecosystem. The human interactive component of this ecosystem cannot be overstated. It was a significant component that shaped the historical force and generated so much of the biodiversity or general life. Now, the reason that's important, when you look at our Western constructs are what we believe. A Western construct basically says that we as humans are separate from the forest, or we are separate and above it, where the indigenous approach towards the forested ecosystems were that they were part of it. The reason this is important is when both disease and genocide occurred, and the removal of the indigenous people from these ecosystems, that removal of that human interactive component was key to, and still key today, to the health of many of these forested ecosystems. And that is not even taught in our schools, and folks don't understand that. Instead, we have this principle of National Park Service, where go to the national park, take a picture, they'll say, leave only with memories and footprints, but take nothing. And these forested ecosystems are actually cohabitate or coexist with human presence. And that is a huge part of what's missing out of here. And that's proper human stewardship on that forest. This is not going in and exploiting the resources. Next slide, please, John. So when fire is utilized, what fire does from a biological perspective, it introduces disturbance. And this disturbance is a temporary change in environmental conditions that causes a pronounced change in the ecosystem itself. Disturbances often act quickly with great effect, and they alter the physical structure. And when you consider that it was through acts of disturbance that really generated the desired state. So if you look at this photo here, this pretty fascinating little photo. These are pictures of wild hyacinths or round-toothed ukal. They were geophyte. The bulbs were harvested by the indigenous people. But you look carefully, on one of the flower blooms is a native bee, and on the other flower bloom is a domestic honeybee. And this is a good example of cross-societal values. Where we say, well, we need pollinating insects to pollinate all our food stocks, whether they're native or they're domesticated. So here's a great example where bringing back through proper stewardship the native nectaring plants has a cross-societal value at all levels. So next slide, please. So here's kind of the key. This is what's substantial. So plant diversity generates biodiversity. So when you look at that plant diversity, it is essential for have overall biodiversity. We're talking the invertebrates. We're talking the insects. We're talking the reptiles, the fish, the birds. Everything that walks and creeps and crawls on the ground, flies above it, or crawls below it in the soils, requires this plant diversity. In this case of Mount Howe, we regenerated the herbaceous understory and begins to process diversity in all forms of life. And a very good example of societal values would say you have someone who's purely, their whole purpose in life is native birds. So they're part of the Audubon Society. Well, many native birds require insects. Well, many of these native insects require the native plants. And therefore, to have more native birds, you got to have more native plants to have more native insects. So you kind of see this whole basic concept of ecology going around in a circle. So again, that's how, again, you kind of reach across the proverbial aisle to those folks that sit there and you see, okay, well, you may be that computer programmer in Silicon Valley and your hobby is bird watching native birds, then the restoration of the ecosystems all through California support those native birds as they may be migratory in nature. And so you may not realize that the lands by the Chumash down in Southern California, that the reason those birds are up in the Bay Area is simply because they're maintaining their native lands. So disturbance properly applied leads to plant diversity and then to overall biodiversity. Next, please, John. And in that previous photo, again, I apologize. One of the things there was the grass stalks, and the grass stalks there were blue wild rye, and the blue wild rye was harvested also by the indigenous folks here as a food source. So when we look at what we're talking about, restoration and disturbance, restoration of the plant community is cultural landscape restoration. So the cultural landscape was actually an historical landscape. So when the Euro-Americans came into California, what they saw is a beautiful park-like setting with tremendous and abundance of wildlife. There was an assumption made that this was a naturally occurring landscape, and that assumption was erroneous in many cases, as it actually was a human managed landscape, an anthropogenic managed landscape. And so when we go back into we look at this, our historical landscapes were actually culturally generated by human beings. So this kind of flies in the face of that humans are set aside from nature, but rather In the case of most of our ecosystems, California, humans were that interactive component that in turn generated through proper stewardship. Next slide, please. So here's kind of the big thing for modern day. Historical landscapes were adaptive and resilient. So you look at our modern problems, we're having a climate change with a lack of plant diversity, clean air, clean water, hot destructive wildfires, that would happen when humans properly interact with their landscape and provide traditional ecological knowledge and employ indigenous management practices. In the case of many parts of West Slope Sierra Nevada mountain range, it becomes fire adaptive again. It is human adaptive, interactive, and arguably, as I point out, it's dependent upon humans. It's disturbance adaptive. That is, it wants that disturbance to come in to stimulate life. It's drought adaptive. We're currently in a significant drought here in all through California, actually severe to extreme. But when the plant communities return to its historical, plant association in numbers, it is drought adaptive. But here's the big thing: it is when restored, it is climate change adaptive when restored to its historical structure and plant association. And as a quick example, over the last 1,000 years, we have here in California, and again, particularly the West Slope Sierra Nevada mountain range, has been through 3 major climate change events. The first was in the last 1,000 years was about 900 AD or Common Era to approximately 1250, 1300 Common Era. And that was known as the Sierra Nevada mega drought period. It is also known as a medieval warming period, and it became very hot and dry in California, but yet the forest survived just fine because we still have that same forest today. Then we entered into the period called the Little Ice Age. The Little Ice Age went from about 1300 to about 1850 to present, which was the beginning of quote unquote the California gold rush. And during that time, it actually became colder and wetter. And again, the plant community adapted just fine. From 1850 to present day, it is believed that it's actually been warmer and wetter than historical. And now we think with the climatologists think we're now in a 4th climate event or climate change event is going back to hotter and drier. And there's some discussion that actually we're reverting back to the climate that occurred 1,000 years ago. The point being is these plants are climate change adaptive when they're in proper numbers and plant association. So climate change doesn't need to be this terrifying thing to us if we can work with our plant community. Next, please, John. So you look at climate change and carbon sequestration. You know, when we generate plant diversity, we generate biodiversity, basically we generate life. And since all life is carbon-based, the greater the biodiversity, the greater the carbon sequestration and capturing. Cultural landscapes generated by ancestral Californias can significantly sequester carbon. In other words, what's amazing about climate change and our turn towards green technology is the ancestral Californias developed the original green technology that works the best. No machine, no technology can begin to even approach what native plant communities can do to clean up the environment. So this pivot to technology by us as a society is ironically appropriate, but yet our best allies are our natural resources out there and our cultural historical forests. Next, please, John. And the photo there are just 2, those are Pipevine Swallowtails that are responding to the bloom of blue deck flowers. So when we look at fire on the landscape, historical cultural fire, for the most part in the Sierra Nevada mountain range, was basically very low intensity. It was a creeping, crawling fire, and it did recycle nutrients. It reduced the fuel loading. It eliminated the carry fuels for hot destructive fires. It killed forced pests that were not, for example, ticks, as an example of a forced pest. It provided disturbance. It provided a biochar. It produced a very light smoke compared to our hot destructive fires of today. And they were principally conducted in late fall or early winter after plants enter dormancy. But bear in mind, fire was entered at the landscape from the valley floor to the very high levels of the Sierra Nevada mountain range, depending on what the village, if you will, or what the Indians wanted from the landscape. So they may have burned out a slope early on in June, but burned the rest of the landscape later on that fall. So the fire that was utilized was a tool, and that tool was applied for whatever the goal was. What did they want to achieve from the native plant community? Was it food? Was it medicine? Was it tool? Was it pest management? So they had this incredibly brilliant strategy and tactics of when and where and why to apply fire. And again, that's a great example of traditional ecological knowledge that is, developed California, large portion of California's ecosystems. Next, please, John. So one of the things I find fascinating, going back to climate change, is the generation of biochar. Biochar is simply unburned plant material. The biochar increases soil porosity, allowing water to enter in, and therefore what happens, you get more water into the watershed, very critical in drought periods we have now. It creates housing for microbial soil organisms. It absorbs nitrous oxide, a greenhouse gas 300 times worse than carbon dioxide. It absorbs methane gas 24 times worse than carbon dioxide. But here's what's fascinating, is that when you look at a pound of biochar that can enter into the soil, that for every pound of carbon, which is biochar, that you can generate and capture or sequester, prevents the formation of 3.6 pounds of carbon dioxide, a greenhouse gas. And when you look at that carbon can remain in the soils up to 50 to 1,000 years. There's now a study coming out of Japan that biochar that enters into the soils can remain up to 50,000 years. So you can literally burn your way to clean air if it's a low intensity fire done right. And if we begin to look at our forested ecosystem saying, hey, how can we take this biochar? And you see the feedback loop. We put that, we take that feedback loop of carbon, we put it in the soils, it enhances the soil's capability of growing. The plants grow more readily, and you can see where more and more carbon gets captured, and you begin a very good spin-up cycle of capturing carbon. Again, you got to turn back, and here's this wonderful ancient technology of the indigenous Californians that has a very modern application to where we are in fighting climate change and has great societal value and acceptance. Next, please, John. And here's kind of a neat little thing. This, if you look at the photo there, you look at the biochar generated in a low intensity burn. Look how aggressively the roots are growing into that plant. That plant is just loving that biochar. But when we have hot, destructive wildfires like we've had as of late, with say the last 5 years, these mega fires, those kinds of fires are actually destructive to soils. And they actually produce very little biochar, about 3%. Most of the forest structure is covered in what's called white ash, and it's volatilized. That is, it's turned into gases and released in the atmosphere. And here's another example. Every climate change measure enacted by California to capture carbon and greenhouse gas emissions has been totally wiped out every summer by fire season by the fire. So whatever savings they made by increasing the mile standard by vehicles, by putting on solar panels on roofs, so on and so forth, all that net saving has been lost every fire season as of late, and has actually set California back about 20 years on carbon capturing. Again, we pivot back to traditional ecological knowledge and indigenous management practices. So the point of all that is that low intensity burns to enhance plant management reduces and results in reduction of hot destructive fires, and again allows us to fight climate change. Again, here's an incredible technology that has present day applications, and we needed to do that. So On that note, go ahead and advance, please. So one of the big advantages, going back to food issues, food desert, food crisis, and generating food, is geophytes, commonly known as indigenous potatoes. But geophytes are plants that do underground storage of organs, bulbs, corms. And a classic modern day geophytes, an onion, a garlic bulb that most common people could understand, recognize. But what happens is geophytes have a tremendous positive response to fire. And so one of the ways that you can ecologically restore geophyte in a plant community is to do a low intensity burn. And again, these have the advantages not only in providing food and sustainability, but they also have the ability that, again, going back to pollinating insects and things of that nature. And again, the photo here, in the foreground, the broader leaves are bold tube viruses that are responding to the burn. They are, again, were harvested as basketry, the roots were. And then there's smaller grass-like appearances. Those are actually round-toothed cows and some yellow star tulips. And the yellow star tulips also were harvested as a food source. So again, here's a wonderful response to fire, purely for the purpose of, in this case, stimulating the geophyte plant community. And this is what the ancestors did. And in doing that, simply provide food. So their plow tool, their farming machinery, for lack of a better word, was the use of fire in this case. Next slide, please. So again, another picture of yellow star tulips and bold tube irises, and this is post-fire generation. And if you look at, you see some holly leaf structures behind the yellow star tulips. Those are actually Oregon grapes. And again, they were food, they were medicine, and the roots are yellow, they were a dye. So again, here's an example of regenerating the native plant community to meet indigenous needs. Next slide, please. This is another picture of a bold tube iris for folks that out there. But if you look carefully, you see the if you look at the leaf structure, you have black oak leaves and you have the ponderosa pine needles there, and that those dead dry fuels are the carrier fuel. So in this case, the leaf structure is the fire adaptive trait of the pines and oaks there. And the purpose of those long loose leaves and those long loose pine needles is simply to transmit fire. So in the case of black oaks and ponderosa pines, their fire adaptive trait is to use fire to keep the ground clear underneath them to eliminate competition. And the net result is you wind up generating a nice herbaceous understory. Next photo, please. Again, this is a Sierra Fawn lily. Again, this is another geophyte. Again, they respond tremendously. Well, what I have found with the what I have found is that the geophytes, in the case of the Sierra Fawn lilies, when we have burned here locally, they literally come back in the thousands, and almost to the appearance of grass-like. I did see one chat, yes, the comment. Yes, if the pine needle is long and loose, the purpose of that long, loose pine needle is literally to transmit fire under the pine tree, in the case of ponderosa pine. And it uses, that's its fire adaptive trait. And that pine needle, the purpose of pine needle is to keep the ground clear underneath the pine tree of other trees, brush, and shrubs. It is its fire adaptive trait to eliminate competition. I hope that helps you out there. We can discuss that after this presentation. Next slide, please. And again, here is, one moment, please. Here are Sierra Fawn lilies, and this is generated after a second fire return interval. And this is what I got down. And you look at that picture there, you look at an area that's probably no less than maybe 2 feet by 2 feet in size. And there are literally about 100 fawn lilies of this area blanketed on the forest floor for about an acre. I mean, literally thousands and thousands of Sierra Fawn lilies were generated after post-fire conditions. Next, please. Again, brownbill, these are brownbill fritillaries, another geophyte, again, harvested by indigenous folks for food. Next photo, please. And here we have blue dicks. That's that purple flower, that light blue flower you see there. They respond very well to post-fire treatment. And this was a first fire return interval. And all those blue flowers you see there have a corresponding bulb. And this was a prized food source for indigenous people all over California. In fact, these bulbs were dug up and transported to the east side of the Sierra Nevada mountain range as indigenous folks traded. And so it was turned as assisted migration. But again, this plant community of blue dicks will increase now in numbers as they'll have a good seed production, which will drop to the ground and continue to grow. Next slide, please. So when you look at the value of native plants, you know, we look at the native plants. What we wind up with is an incredible understory. So consider this: 100 years ago, approximately half of the Sierra Nevada mountain range is classified as grazing grounds. And this is due to native bunch grasses that in turn generate, you know, mycorrhizae, which is basically fungus filaments that interconnect the plants, and they actually use a food sharing communication system through fungus. These herbaceous understories now interconnect to the trees and brush, and what you have is an incredible diverse ecosystem that relies on basically this fungus networking system to communicate and food share. So it's a pretty amazing little ecosystem that was set up. And again, the indigenous folks may not have understood the deep science behind it, but they understood the results of what their efforts were from. Again, next photo. But when you look at restoring photos, for every 10 pounds of organic material, that is the vegetation on top, becomes 1 pound organic matter. Now consider a current drought. If you increase organic matter by 1% in 1 acre of ground, that 1 acre of ground could hold 20,000 gallons of water. The soil will stay wetter longer, the forest fuel will stay wetter longer, they're more fire resilient, and more water enters into the watershed and then slowly leaches out to have nice cool streams for your salmonid species, your steelhead, your salmon, things of that nature. And you sequester tons of greenhouse gases. You know, it is said there is more life in a handful of healthy soils than there are human beings on planet Earth. So again, another way to fight climate change, but again, just good, healthy, resilient, forested ecosystems that bring all the societal values that we all want and need. Next photo, please. Next slide, please. And when you have healthy soils, they provide carbon sequestration, fire resiliency through healthy plants, water retention and flood control due to increased water infiltration. Okay, we may not have to build so many dams, greater plant diversity, which leads to greater biodiversity, and requires less amounts of rainfall for plant growth to remain. And if you look at the soil sample here, look at the amount of earthworms that are in that photo from this shovel spade being turned over. And that's a good example of good traditional ecological knowledge in restoring soil health. And those earthworms are going to make wonderful soils as from the worm castings. Plus, the earthworms, as they live out their lives, to create these incredible channels that channel the water into the soils and increase the rate of we call rain infiltration. So it reduces flooding, gets more water into the soils, therefore into the watershed and into quote unquote people's wells and into the cool streams and rivers. Next slide, please. Here's something that's near and important to us. So this is purple milkweed. And if you look at the name, the second name of the scientific name is cordifolia. This plant was harvested by indigenous people because of its fiber strands to make cordage. But it's a critical plant for the survival of the monarch butterfly. Now, here's something that's pretty tragic. The 2020 population count for monarch butterflies at 246 sites on the coast of California only came back as 1,900 insects, which is devastating. And these monarch butterflies, that is the West Coast monarch butterflies, now face the very real possibility of extinction. The population collapse was 30,000, and again, we're at 1,900 insects. But when you burn, one of the things it does is it clears the ground of vegetation. And in this case, all milkweeds propagate through the use of the seeds travel on a silky fiber, much like a dandelion. And the seeds need to have soil contact. So one of the ways that you can save the monarch butterfly is by opening up the ground and let the seeds have soil contact to generate it. Monarch butterfly require native milkweed as the host plant to deposit the larva. So again, the combination of the lack of fire has resulted in a significant decline of purple milkweed. And as an example, when we burned up at Mount Howe, what we found in one unit, approximately about 3 to 4 acres in size, our purple milkweed plants went from about 10 plants approximately to within 2 years to 245 plants. And that's a substantial increase in the purple milkweed population. But again, here's that traditional ecological knowledge where the ancestral Californias were burning to generate these plants for cordage, for the purpose of cordage, making ropes and twine. And the benefit factor to that was, of course, the monarch butterfly as a host plant for its larva. And you look carefully on the plant, you see you see a larva there. This photo was taken several years ago, and I've not seen the monarchs back since, unfortunately. Next photo, please. So is it advancing there, John? There you go. Here's another great example. This is miner's lettuce. It's a fire follower. So we look at miner's lettuce or red maize as a food source. The indigenous folks figured out pretty fast that what they needed as a fire following species is fire to occur on 1 to 3 year intervals to generate these food products. And if not, the plant basically goes into a seed bank, drops the seed into the soils, and it waits for the next fire return interval. So in the case of red maize, in the case of miner's lettuce, and actually in the same plant family, they require frequent fire return intervals to generate the plants. The term miner's lettuce is kind of a fascinating name because it was shared with the miners by the California Indians as a way to combat scurvy due to lack of vitamin C. So here's a great example that indigenous people were sharing their technology, over 200 years ago to save these human beings they knew little about. But they saw humans in suffering, and they took a plant that they knew that would fight scurvy, and told the miners, eat this, and you'll recover from scurvy. So here's a great example of cross-cultural sharing that benefited the miners. Next photo, please. Black oaks. I had this little thing on black oaks in here, and if you can read the information, it's pretty fascinating about why we need to look out for all our oak trees. But if you consider they can live up to 500 years, but they don't begin to reach maturity to 90 years of age. When we're approaching our death or have long died, if we planted a black oak, it's just approaching maturity. They don't begin to produce acorns till they're about 25 years of age or thereabouts, and they're fire adapted, require low intensity. They're subclimax and on-shade tolerant. So with that said and done, go ahead to the next photo, please. I have this on black oaks because they're a fascinating tree. What you look at here is, and not until 30 years of age does a black oak begin to produce acorns. And then it's about 5 pounds at 50 years of age. They really don't begin to produce acorns till they get into about 80 to 100 years of age, and about 200 years of age when they start beginning producing acorns of quality. And again, a great food source. But black oaks, amazingly, are considered now on the west slope as one of the most important wildlife species trees. So if you want more wildlife, you have to maintain your black oaks. Black oaks had that loose leaf structure, and that loose leaf structure, a black oak wants that burn to eliminate competition to the tree. So you see the fire adaptive trait of the black oak that, again, the ancestral Californians figured out was, if we want food and we want to share that food with our brother and sister animals out there, then we need to tend and take care of our oak trees. So you see this incredible sharing knowledge of traditional ecological knowledge. Next photo, please, or slide. Again, this is what they call a mast crop. It's an old English term which means highly productive. So there's an example of a mast crop. Next photo, please. I think it's just an expansion of that photo there. Yeah, there's just a great example of a black oak just in a mast crop. We had a mast crop last year. But for black oaks to reproduce, they need to have soil contact. Oaks cannot grow unless the acorn can make contact with the soil. Otherwise, the acorn simply rots away. So again, if you do not burn and open up the soils, you cannot get the oak trees to reproduce. Yeah, bumper crop works too also. Next photo, please. Or slide. Going back to the necessity of wildlife, here's a great example. This is an acorn woodpecker, and this is what we call a granary tree, much like a granary to store grain in. In this case, this acorn woodpecker is out here, and you can see the acorns. It is stuck into this old snag. And so again, here's a great example of sharing, a very ancestral way of belief that humans are part of nature, not separate from nature, and in that is responsibility to share with all the other animals that occupy that forested system. And again, over 300 species of wildlife use oak woodlands for food, cover, and reproduction. So again, the societal values of TAK is we want more wildlife. Well, this is how your ancestors generated. Next slide, please. And we're almost done, ladies and gentlemen. This little guy is just always, people get a kick out of him. That's all he's there for. Here's an example of a flamulated owl, and it's primarily found in open coniferous forests, especially ponderosa pine, but it hunts the black oak forest. And so what it relies on the acorns for rodents to hunt. And these are very difficult birds to see. You see how well camouflaged this little guy is against the base of the tree. You could walk right past him, never know that he was there. But they rely on the black oak or oak structures for hunting to hunt the rodents that are in turn feeding on the acorns. Just an example of that good old-fashioned ecosystems. Next slide, please. Again, California fisher relies heavily on hunting corridors generated by oak trees. And this species, not known as, numbers not known a lot about them, but they rely on good functioning ecosystems to survive. And they're a beautiful animal, but they're out there, and if you see one, it's a rarity. Next slide, please. And again, here's the base of black oak acorn. You see the potential denning site for a fisher. It's hollow underneath, and that's a classic example of a denning site for Pacific fisher. So tending to the trees, doing it properly, keeping fire from entering into the trees, again, wildlife benefits. Next slide, please. So this little guy, this is the Filbert weevil and the Filbert worm. This is what invades the acorn. So here's a great example of pest management. Indians often applied fire under the oak trees to kill this little critter, this pest insect that actually lives in the soils and in the old leaf fall and branch fall of the oaks. So pest management was a strategy used by California Indians by use of fire to keep clear the oak trees to eliminate the Filbert weevil and Filbert worm. If you look at the bottom of the verbiage here, now due to the lack of fire, 85 to 90% of all acorn crop productions are now failing due to infestation. And from that, the lack of fire means an increase of this pest insect, which means a decrease in acorn production, which means a decrease in wildlife. You can see how things can spin backwards out of control. Next slide, please. And here's a great example of what the Filbert weevil worm does. There's a little hole that it bores into the acorn, and no longer a viable food source and or seed. Next slide, please. So what's the takeaway here? The takeaway is tribal cultural resources. The greatest tribal cultural resource is the knowledge and utilization of indigenous management practices and the application of traditional ecological knowledge. It's a proven knowledge. It generated the greatest period of biodiversity in history of these lands. And your ancestors, that is ancestral Californians, have provided one of the greatest tools to counter climate change, protect endangered species, increase water yields, clean the air, rebuild soils, and hot destructive fires and save lives. It's a simple, elegant, and a very brilliant system. And that should wrap it up. So as John navigates out of here.
Yeah, we're back.
We're back.
That was incredible. I cannot even fathom how much I just learned. Thank you so much, Chris. That was, I'm speechless.
Thank you, John. You know, one of the things there that I want to point out to folks, if you consider really quick, the hot destructive fires. I listened to all your previous casts, and there was two ladies up in Chico talked about the value of paying folks to steward the lands. If you consider 10 years ago, for every dollar spent on doing land management, it saved $7 in fire suppression. So again, there's a great example there of how a societal value goes back to that value. You know, and one of the things I want to do is open up for questions and conversations for your platform. And so I'll shut up so you all can talk.
Yeah, thanks. Thanks again, Chris. That was Allie Metter's night and Mel Figueroa and Chico. Allie just got acknowledged by her tribe as a traditional ecological knowledge master, and she's hosting classes every Friday from 10 a.m. to 1 p.m. at Elysium Fields in Chico. So
Wow.
if y'all are ever up there and want to go by, and she actually is the one that introduced me to Steve Walensky, who hosted our third listening session. And he's running an all indigenous fire crew in 8 Sierra counties, including Placer in Nevada. So great resources there. The conversation in the chat was awesome. Thank you to everyone that contributed there. Does anyone have questions for Chris or Francis? Personally, I'd like to know more about how you got involved with the Todd Valley project and what the hope is, and how everyone on this call can put some pressure on the right people to get that land returned to them.
So in response to that question, Francis and I were put in contact with a mutual acquaintance, a friend of ours, Luana Dowling. She is actually in part descendant of Lakota Sioux. And as Francis and I were put in contact with one another, one of our visions, our hopeful visions is to take this land, steward it through both indigenous management practices and TEK, traditional ecological knowledge. And what we hope to demonstrate is a compare and contrast force compared to what's going on currently in the neighboring forested ecosystems. We use it as a teaching tool to anything to the small property owner who's moved recently to the area that we have a caller in that has 2 acres of size, and then to the larger scale. So the hope is to educate, inform, and provide an outreach. And one of the things that's very important to Francis and I is to have fun doing it. And it's the enjoyment of being interactive in that forest. That is a lot of fun. And while the work is serious, Francis and I had this conversation earlier today that, you know, as the Indians occupied this land, they laughed, they played, they had fun, they interacted with the community. And so while the work is serious work, if you don't enjoy the work, if you're not enjoying the work, if you're overly too serious about it, then I think from just a human perspective, regardless of where our ancestors come from, you're missing a big part of it. So the goal is demonstration, teaching, and be able to compare and contrast.
All right, cool. We actually had a couple people join after the presentation began. One of them will be hosting our next roundtable in May. That's Tina. So I was hoping that she could say a little something and give us a little teaser about what's going to happen next month.
Yeah. Yes, hi, John. Hello, relatives. And Chris, thank you so much for what a wonderful presentation. Very informative.
Thank you, Tina.
So yeah, next month I will be sharing a little bit about the Ahachman Tongva Land Conservancy. It's very new and a lot to share with y'all. I'll just leave it that as a little teaser. Thank you for hosting this forum, John.
It's my honor. Thank you so much for joining us and looking forward to next month as well. Does anyone else have any questions or additions?
I'd like to say something. Is that okay?
Absolutely. Thank you.
So I don't know if you guys are familiar with the Yuba Watershed Institute, but we are managing 1,300 acres of BLM land, and it's generated by the neighbors, basically, and a lot of people who've been studying a long time. And a lot of the reason that I got involved with them was partly because they're all a bunch of white guys, and they talk a big game about native peoples and tribal ways and things like that. But tribal people and women have been basically left out of the conversation. And so, I mean, I think they're incredibly well-intended people, but they're also hermits and, you know, academics and whatever, and have done incredible work. And I think it's aligned with a lot of the traditional ecological knowledge. But I'm really interested in bringing native people, like giving them back the possibility of engaging with these lands. And I have this, I guess my question is, like, how do we come back from this place where all these people with the power and the privilege are disconnected from the native folks who have the, you know, sort of moral right to be doing that work, but only these other people are able to, or have so far been able to do that work here.
If I may, Amber, and Francis, please speak up to this. I think the initial goal should be co-management in cases where the traditional knowledge has been lost. That's where I serve as a technical advisor and honorably serve as a technical advisor to the Todd Valley Miwok Maidu. And my goal is just to share the information that I have gained back to them, because the information I gained, a lot of it came from indigenous people and the capturing that information. So in the cases where the indigenous folks are up and running good and strong, nothing needs to be done. I think one of the biggest things that quote unquote old white people can do, like myself, respectfully, is take our agency knowledge that we have. And this is where I, again, serve the Todd Valley Cultural Foundation, say, I speak agency. And because I speak agency, I can now go on and be a liaison on their behalf and help them get through that bureaucracy and speak and advocate. And one of the things he said is very important. People don't realize most of the fire keepers were women in many of the tribes because they were the most interactive part of the plant community. And depending on the tribe and relationship, the women were an integral part of maintaining the plant community. So there is this cross sharing of knowledge that needs to occur, but you know, as we go through this cultural shift, to me it's unity. I think one of the things you got to be very careful of. Through division, nature destroys. Through unity, we are durable, and durability is what nature teaches us as being successful. So I say come together, you know, work together and work towards that common goal. And as far as getting lands back to the stewardship of Indigenous people, Frances, I think you need to speak up here. This is where, as a good demo, where it works. And she reached out to Bill M. So I'm going to kick over to Frances.
Yeah, I think Chris is on the right track for everybody. It's been too divisive for way too long. I grew up with burning and Indigenous, you know, practices that I didn't consider the science behind it until I went to college and learned science. I have a degree in biology with a minor in chemistry, and I taught K-12 for 30 years. I started my teaching career teaching marine biology to 6th and 7th graders and living out on the coast in tents for days at a time. So, you know, I learned that working with people made it a lot easier than trying to establish an ownership of territory, so to speak. And when it came real evident that what we had was a gift of 18.5 acres from BLM to use for our ceremonial services, and what was lacking was the environment to do it in. And so as we started and finally realized, because the land told us that they were not happy with us and that the practices that we were doing was disturbing them, and it came to us very graphically in their way. Our ancestors told us, this is not right until you do right with this land. And so I think that's where the thought came from, that what we were doing was not paying attention to our heritage. And we weren't going to be able to do what we thought we wanted to do without incorporating more help. We're not a large tribe. We're dying regular, you know, on a yearly basis, it seems. So we're losing a lot of our knowledge. And when Chris came to us, he brought some of that knowledge back to us. And it's our purpose to educate not only our personal, you know, Indian community, but also the community that we live in. And it got to be much more urgent when the wildfires were in our backyard. And we were looking at our forest and realizing we were a tinderbox. So with that, that's where I connected with Luana. Luana had resources that helped us out. And through Luana, we met Chris. And from Chris, I read many books, including Tending the Wild, and watched many, many videos. And I started understanding what it was we were being told. And that was, if we wanted to utilize this land for our purposes, that we needed to take it seriously and bring back our management. What I grew up with, which got snuffed because the air pollution control people decided they didn't like our smoke. But, you know, we controlled the tarweed, we controlled the cedar growth, we controlled the insects in our acorn, we controlled where our deer were able to forage and where we could find them for hunting, as well as the quail and all the other wildlife that my father consumed that sometimes we wouldn't consume because not many people like to eat squirrel. So what we want needs everyone to be on board. And I don't care what your heritage is. If you have the interest, if you have the drive, if you have the need to help the environment in order to make our lives better, then look beyond the color and start to work together and communicate and listen. It's very, very important to listen and then to take those lessons you learn and put them into practice. And that's what we're trying to do. Thank you, Chris.
Thank you, Francis.
Can I add something to Amber's point?
Please.
Sure. Sorry, I can't seem to turn my camera on for some reason. You know, I think Amber's really onto something, because all of the government bureaucracies have a sort of their own inherited set of practices and their own sort of codes and languages and funding streams and results measurements and all of these frameworks that are set into their way of doing things. And I think really we have to be confronting the truth of that, which is that that way of doing things comes from a specific historical moment when the invaders basically said, you know, we have a superior way of managing this land and it is wasted, it is unproductive, quote unquote, in the hands of the indigenous. And there was this sort of moral superiority given to the way that they treated the land. And until you sort of confront that honestly and say it for what it is and then examine it, it's really going to be sort of talking apples and oranges. And I totally agree with what Francis said, that that divide can only be bridged by sort of learning from each other, but it also requires a kind of interruption of a sort of inherited set of practices. And I think that's where it does involve saying, okay, so the way that we've worked so far has some limitations. You know, what are some other cultural practices that we can take? And it has to be cultural, not just in the language of the bureaucracies, which separates culture from sort of managing the land. It has to be cultural because it does involve a different relationship to land by people. It's fundamentally a different relationship between humans and the land. And it can't just be sort of siloed as land management practices. It's really the way that humans behave and live in concert with the land, which was so fundamentally different in the two cultures than when they met. And I think consistently there's this kind of glossing over of the language, and we sort of generally say our history. And I think it's important to say indigenous people's history. I think it's important to recognize that for what it is and be honest about it. And then it becomes our history.
Yeah, you're right about that, Ansu. No question. That's what you know, the whole mission of Return California is to paint with much more specific strokes rather than such a broad one. The concept of land back really has informed our efforts with these roundtables and with creating a database of resources that tribes can access so that they don't have to reinvent the wheel. They can learn from the successes of the other tribes in California and practice the things that they're doing that are really helpful and useful. Thanks for clarifying that.
And Enzo, if I may, everything you said, I am in full agreement with. The challenge that I see is there is so little knowledge of cultural practices and indigenous management practices in DAK, is getting that into the mainstream out there, that people understand what it is ancestral Californians generated and what they did and what the relation to the land was. And that's not even taught at the elementary school level in California, let alone the high school level. And it's only taught at the collegiate level if the person is pushed into those studies or has a natural tendency to move to those studies. And that's the heavy lift, I call it, because you're right. The European approach to land management has had disastrous results. And the Mediterranean conversion of California has had disastrous results. And so the challenge for all of us that want to see this change in heavy employment of cultural practices and getting land back to cultural stewardship. I just want to iterate, you're right, you're correct, but the challenge for all of us is how do you move 39 million people in that direction when there's in California, supposedly the 720,000 Indians living in California residing now currently. And there's only a small fragment of us that are interested in moving in this direction. So it's a heavy lift, but it's a lift worth undertaking. That's one that supports you, that's all.
I just put a link in the chat to a series that the Humboldt County Office of Education is doing in conjunction with several tribes, including the Karuk, the Yurok, the Wayat, and the Hupa. And they're conducting regular seminars for teachers with curriculum around all of these issues. And as a person who's formally studied in education, I got my master's in education from UC Santa Cruz. To maintain my credential, I have to do professional development. So I've been able to use this Humboldt County Office of Education as part of the process. And it's been incredible. And the people that they have on board are so knowledgeable. That's how I met Margot Robbins from the Karuk Cultural Fire. I also included a link to her organization in the chat. And these conversations are essential to getting the information out there. So please share. Anytime you think of something that's relevant, forward it to me, or and I'll broadcast it out. We have very large engagement. 600 tribal representatives get our emails, and every time we do one of these, it gets more popular. And I'm beside myself to see what Tina's got for us next month. The work being done in the indigenous community around land trusts and restoration is just so exciting. So such an honor to be a part of this conversation. If there's nothing else, I think we'll call it. It's been about an hour and a half. Really great hosting you all. And
John, could I say one quick thing?
Sure, of course.
I would like to back up what Chris Paulus was just saying. As someone who has done a lot of studies. I hold no formal degrees, but I have always pursued more and more education. And I know that I know a lot about a lot of different things. And I also know that I know very little when it comes to Indigenous rights, Indigenous issues. Recently looking into some of it, I've come to learn some of the different legal loopholes and stuff that are specifically there just for Indigenous nations. And really, it seems it's meant to hold them up from doing anything. Part of me has been realizing that there is a serious lack of ability for folks like myself to be able to just go somewhere, be it online or in person, or, you know, with the pandemic, probably just online. But somewhere we can go to learn all of this stuff that we need to know and don't really have access to. So I really value Chris's assessment of it there, and I agree.
Thanks for that,
Thank
Jason.
you, John. Jason.
We're definitely on the right page, or right path rather. We're going to put together those systems online and in person for this kind of education. And it is already happening. If you're in Chico, go check out Verbena Fields on Friday. That's a workshop outdoors, socially distanced, where you can learn all this stuff from the masters. So, Tina, did you have something to say?
No, I was saying nice. I love that.
Yeah. And, you know, it is really awesome that so many women are really stepping up to the plate with this conversation, especially around cultural fire. Margot Robbins and Elizabeth Azuz, they're doing incredible work. They were featured on NPR. The Karuk have been doing really awesome stuff with cultural burning, and the most recent California fire assessments included all of their work, and it was just, it's really promising to see official government resources mentioning the significance and importance of cultural burning and TEK. So I think we're on the right path, and I commend everyone who's doing this work, and will continue to do whatever I can to make sure everybody knows about it. So without anything else, I'm going to say adieu. Thank you all so much for joining us, and hopefully you can join us next month. I know Tina will.
Thank you. Take care.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Thank you, John, for hosting.
My pleasure.
All right.